It's strange how a single choice can grow into something that feels like it rewrites the entire structure of your life. And looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact second I should have walked away, the exact moment I should have told myself, "This is a bad idea." But instead, I let my curiosity outweigh my better judgment. And because of that, I now carry this memory like a weight chained to my spine. And maybe that's why I'm telling you this, because if you're ever in a position like I was that night, maybe you'll listen to the warning I ignored. It started with a text from my friend Leela on a Saturday evening, one of those quick, half-serious messages that read, "Hey, want to check out the old factory with me?" And my first instinct was to type nope and move on. But I'd had this restless energy all week, like I couldn't sit still, and the idea of a small adventure, even an illegal, probably dumb one, felt tempting, especially because the abandoned building she meant wasn't just any building. It was that building, the hulking brick skeleton at the edge of town that everyone had a story about, the one where teenagers dared each other to go at night and came back swearing they heard footsteps or whispers, the one I'd driven past hundreds of times but never entered, its windows like dark, watchful eyes, some shattered, some covered in plywood spray-painted with obscenities and strange symbols. I could never quite decipher. I'd grown up hearing rumors about it, how it used to be a textile factory in the 1940s, how a boiler exploded and killed a dozen workers, how the owner supposedly hung himself in the office afterward, and although none of those stories were confirmed, no one ever tried to renovate or tear it down. It just sat there rotting, year after year, and by the time Lila suggested sneaking in, I realized a part of me had always wanted to see inside. We met just after 10 p.m. in the gravel lot of a closed-down diner nearby, the air thick with that damp late summer smell, crickets chirping somewhere in the weeds. The town so quiet it felt like the world had already gone to sleep, and Lila showed up with a flashlight that looked way too small for exploring. A place that big, a backpack slung over her shoulder, like she'd packed for a weekend trip. And she grinned at me, like we were doing something brave and cinematic, not reckless and stupid. The factory loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the faint glow of the town's streetlights, and as we got closer, the details sharpened, peeling paint on metal doors, rust streaks like dried blood dripping down the walls, tufts of grass pushing through cracks in the concrete loading dock. We found a spot in the chain-link fence, where it had been cut open long ago, edges curled outward like broken ribs, and slipped inside without a word. Our footsteps crunching on bits of gravel and glass, the air colder here, like the building cast its own shadow on the temperature itself. I remember hesitating at the first doorway, my hand brushing the rough brick, feeling how cool it was against my skin, my heart already thumping. But Lila just stepped inside, the beam of her flashlight bouncing off dusty walls covered in faded graffiti, and I followed, telling myself I'd stick close to her and we'd be out in 20 minutes. The interior smelled of mold and something sharper, metallic, like old coins or blood, and every sound the creak of the floor under our weight. The distant drip of water felt amplified in the emptiness. There were long rows of rusted machinery, their belts hanging slack, gears seized up decades ago, and thick cobwebs in the corners where spiders had built cities of their own. Our light caught on something shiny, broken bottles arranged in a circle on the floor, and Lila whispered, weird, like she was cataloging oddities for later. But there was something about the way the bottles reflected our light that made me uneasy, like they were placed there intentionally. Maybe recently we moved deeper, passing through a hallway with broken windows on one side and warped lockers on the other, their doors dented and hanging open, some with scraps of fabric still inside, faded to pale yellow and gray. At one point we heard a noise, not the settling kind of noise you expect in an old building, but something sharper, a scrape, like wood dragging across the floor, and both of us froze. Staring into the darkness ahead, Leela whispered, probably an animal. But the way she said it didn't convince even herself, and I remember how my mouth felt dry as I tried to swallow. We kept going anyway, stupidly, and found ourselves in what must have been the main production floor, a vast space with high ceilings, broken skylights above, and shadows that seemed to move even when we didn't. In the center of the room was something that made me stop completely, a chair, perfectly upright, with a single fresh-looking rope coiled neatly on the seat. The kind of rope you'd buy from a hardware store today. Not something that had been sitting here for decades, and that was when I felt the first real jolt of fear. Because that meant someone had been here recently, maybe even still here. I told Leela we should leave, but she just shrugged and said, "We've come this far," and kept walking toward a set of stairs at the far wall. They led up to a catwalk that creaked under our weight, the flashlight beam revealing more machinery below, and as we reached the other side, we found an office door that was somehow still locked, not rusted shut, but actually locked, the paint around the knob unchipped, almost new, and before I could say anything, Leela reached into her backpack and pulled out a small pry bar, like she'd been planning this all along. The sound of the lock snapping echoed far too loud, and when the door swung open, the smell hit us immediately, something sour and rotten, like meat gone bad, and the beam of light swept across a small room that shouldn't have looked any different from the rest of the factory, but somehow felt wrong, like the air itself was thicker. Inside were a few filing cabinets, a desk with papers scattered on it, and in the corner, a mattress on the floor with a blanket bunched up at the end, and next to it, an empty plate and cup. My brain tried to make sense of it, maybe squatters, but the blanket looked used, the plate had crumbs, and the cup still had water in it, not stale or evaporated. I backed up toward the door, whispering to Lila that we needed to go now, but before she could answer, there was a sound from below us, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the factory floor, and the beam of her flashlight shook as she turned toward me, eyes wide, mouthing, "Did you hear that?" We killed the light instantly, plunging the office into darkness so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, and we stood frozen, listening to the steps draw closer, each one deliberate, until they stopped right beneath us, and in the silence though and uneven, like she was trying to keep it quiet, but couldn't control it. The blackness in the office seemed to press against my eyes, and I remember gripping the edge of the desk so hard my fingers hurt, the metal drawer handle digging into my palm, and then the footsteps started again, but this time they weren't random, they were moving toward the stairs, slow and deliberate, each creak of the old wood below ringing like a countdown. Lila mouthed something I couldn't read in the dark, and then her hand brushed my arm, warm and shaking, pulling me toward the door. But the second we stepped into the catwalk, we heard the first stair groan under weight, and we froze again, listening to those steps rising, closer and closer, until they reached the landing below. I couldn't see him yet, but I could feel him the way the air seemed to shift. The subtle scrape of something metal against the railing, like he was holding an object and dragging it just enough to let us hear it. I tugged on Leela's arm and we backed up, moving in silence along the catwalk, toward the opposite stairs. But then his voice came again, almost casual, "You're making a mistake." And it was said not as a threat but as a statement, like he genuinely believed we'd regret leaving, and that somehow made it so much worse. We started down the far staircase as quietly as possible, but even the smallest shift of weight made the steps creak. And halfway down, we heard movement on the catwalk. He'd chosen to follow us, rather than search the office, so we bolted, throwing caution aside, hitting the main floor hard, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. Our flashlight stayed off. Neither of us wanted to give him a target, so when navigated by faint moonlight spilling through broken windows. But in the dark, the machinery loomed like rusted beasts, and I clipped my shin on a low metal frame, nearly falling. Leela caught me, and we kept running, heading for the open loading dock door we'd passed earlier. But when we got there, my stomach dropped. It was shut now. The heavy metal gate rolled down from the inside, the same one that had been rusted up when we came in, and I knew instantly what that meant. He'd been here before we arrived, maybe even watching us. waiting for us to wander deep enough inside. Lila's breathing was turning into small, panicked gasps, and I knew if she lost control, we were done. So I grabbed her shoulders, forced her to look at me, and whispered, "Back fence side door," and we took off again, this time sticking close to the walls. But as we rounded a corner toward the hallway with the warped lockers, a shape stepped out ahead of us, blocking the way, tall and broad, his outline visible only in the faint ambient light, and in his right hand he held something long and thin. At first I thought it was a crowbar, but when he tilted his head slightly, the glint of the blade told me it was a machete, the edge catching the moonlight just enough to burn the image into my brain forever. We both froze, my mind racing for another exit, and then, without a word, he started walking toward us, slow and steady like he knew there was nowhere for us to go. Lila yanked my hand and pulled me into another hallway, this one narrower, the smell of mold so strong it made my throat burn, and we could hear him behind us, not running, just following, letting us waste our energy while he conserved his. The hallway twisted and opened into another room I didn't recognize, smaller, with shelves knocked over and piles of old paperwork scattered on the floor, and at the far end, a doorway that led into what looked like a service corridor. We ran for it, but the second I crossed the threshold, the floor gave way under my right foot, the wood splintering with a sharp crack, and I went down hard, my leg wedged through the rotted floorboards up to the knee. Panic surged as I tried to yank myself free, the wood scraping my skin, and Lila was pulling at my arms, whispering, come on," through clenched teeth. Footsteps approached, closer now, and then I heard the faintest chuckle, low and mocking, like he was enjoying watching us struggle. Adrenaline gave me the strength I needed. I wrenched my leg free, ignoring the sharp pain, and we stumbled forward. Down the service corridor, which thankfully opened into another section of the factory I did recognize, near the hole in the fence, where we'd entered. My heart leaped at the sight, but the hope was short-lived because, as we neared it, we saw the gap was now blocked with something heavy, a stack of pallets wired together. Not there before, and I realized in that moment that he'd been hurting us, controlling where we could go. Lila swore under her breath, scanning for another way out, and that's when I spotted a small, grimy window above an old desk pushed against the wall. It looked just big enough for us to squeeze through, and without thinking, I scrambled onto the desk, shoving at the window until the rusted latch gave way. Cold night air hit my face, and I swung a leg over, urging Lila to hurry, but before she could reach me, a shadow fell across the wall beside her, and I saw his arm shoot out, grabbing a fistful of her hair. She screamed a short, sharp sound that sliced through the night, and the force of it made her drop the flashlight, which rolled across the floor and came to rest shining directly on his face for the first time. I wish I could say he looked like some monster out of a nightmare, but the truth was worse. He looked ordinary, maybe mid-30s, with close-cropped hair and pale skin, but his eyes were empty, flat in a way that made him seem less human, and in that blankness there was no anger, no thrill, just the quiet, terrifying focus of someone who had already decided what was going to happen. I lunged back inside, grabbing Lila's arm and pulling with everything I had, his grip tightening until I thought he might tear her scalp, and then either by surprise or because he wanted to play he let go, sending her sprawling toward me. We didn't wait to question it. I shoved her through the window first, followed immediately, hitting the cold dirt outside and scrambling to our feet. Running without looking back, the weeds slapping at our legs, the gravel biting into our soles. It wasn't until we'd crossed 2 empty lots and collapsed behind the diner where we'd parked that we dared to stop, both of us gasping, shaking, barely able to speak. I looked toward the factory, half expecting to see him standing there, watching us, but it was silent, the windows black as ever, no movement at all, and then, just as I started to think maybe he wasn't coming after us, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out with trembling hands, just waiting. If you've ever had your own close call, trespassing somewhere you shouldn't have been. I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Your experiences keep this channel alive and connect all of us who know that fear is sometimes very real. If you enjoyed this chilling true encounter, make sure you hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good scare, and subscribe so you don't miss the next time we step into the shadows together. Until then, stay curious, but never too curious.